Good evening. What a joy to be with you guys, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and share tonight. It's been a joy and honor over the last 10 years or so, 11 years now, to write books, novels, and nonfiction books. But I want to be clear that the way I think of myself is not so much as a writer as a failed political consultant. That's really my political or my professional pedigree, in that sense that for the first 10 years of my professional life, I worked for a series of political organizations or policy organizations, and then candidates, and helped all of those candidates lose. Not one of my candidates ever won anything, and so at some point I thought, okay, I really have to do something else. Maybe I'll just make up things for a living. And of course, all my friends thought, you work in Washington, you obviously are making things up for a living, so, but whatever. And one of the things that was sort of a surprise for me was the invitations that came to come and speak at conferences and at various events, churches, synagogues, and all kinds of places and events all over the world. I never sort of linked the idea of writing with being invited to come speak. I'm not saying that I don't realize that other people do that, but I was feeling so low at that point in my professional life that I just wanted to do something different and something that was hopefully useful. And a writer's life, it tends to be a very solitary life. You know, you sort of closet yourself away and try to shut out the rest of the world and sort of enter this zone of doing something different. And so what has happened since then with, when my first book came out, The Last Jihad, it opened with a kamikaze attack against the United States by radical Islamic terrorists that was written 9 months before September 11th. And the novel leads to, that kamikaze attack leads to a war between the United States and Saddam Hussein over terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. I was finishing The Last Jihad on the morning of September 11th, 2001. And I was doing so at the home that my wife and kids and I lived at the time, that we were renting, not far from Washington Dulles Airport, where one of the flights was being hijacked at that moment, turned around, flown over our house, and into the Pentagon. And so when the novel was released, a first novel, no one had ever heard of it, no one had ever heard of me. But because the events in that novel were so much seemingly to be ripped out of the headlines, future headlines, and some as I was writing them, but things that had happened or were about to happen. This was 5 months before the Iraq War when the book actually was released. And so suddenly, I was invited to be on more than 160 radio and television shows in less than 2 months. The book shot up to #1 on the Amazon bestseller list. It was 11 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. And this was first it was a complete surprise. Second of all, it was certainly exciting, but it changed the lives of my wife and children and myself, because suddenly it was a very public life. My political life was very behind the scenes, and now I was being invited to speak on all these shows, and in time invited to the White House and to speak to members of Congress and so forth. And that's been fascinating. And God has opened some interesting doors that I just didn't expect for him to open. And what's happened, and it started in the first book tour. It wasn't even a tour. My publisher didn't have enough confidence in the book to set up a tour. But as we were doing all those radio interviews, I remember it was the first day of the media tour, and one of these hosts said, and this host actually was from my hometown of Rochester, New York. I grew up just outside of Rochester. I'll get to that backstory in a moment. But anyway, I was on this show on a rock station, and I don't know why they put me on this show. I think originally because they didn't think any other stations would have me on. It changed obviously very quickly, but this guy's name was Brother Wease, And it was a station I didn't listen to when I was growing up. And I had heard of Brother Wease. He was sort of a rocker, sort of, sure he could be a Calvary pastor someday, but he's not there yet. Anyway, he has me on, and he's asking me, so dude, how did you know that you were going to write a book about, radical Muslims hijacking a plane and flying it into a city? I mean, that's unbelievable. We talked about that for a while. Well, if you knew that, how did you know that we were going to a war with Iraq, or we're about to? So we talked about that. And he said, well, what do you think's going to happen next if you're so bright? You seem to be like a Nostradamus type guy, So we talked a little bit about where we thought things were going. And he said, now I got a question. Are you a Heb? I said, I'm sorry, a what? He said, a Hebrew. He goes, I'm Jewish, and a name like Rosenberg, you got to be Jewish, right? You're Hebrew? I said, well, yes, I am on my father's side and Gentile on my mother's side. He said, well, what's a nice Jewish boy like you talking about, all your characters talking about Jesus at the end of the book? What are you, a born again? An evangelical? Like it was the worst, toxic nightmare of, radioactive. Ooh. And I said, Mr. Wease, I do believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and I became a follower of Jesus, and I'm fascinated with Bible prophecy, and I weave some of that into this new book, and he goes, well, I don't understand that. I don't understand how you can be Jewish and believe in Jesus. I said, well, Mr. Wease, it's a fascinating story, and obviously we don't have time on your show to talk about it, but listen. He said, it's one thing to have a guy who writes fiction that comes true to be on my show. It's another thing to meet a Jew who believes in Jesus. This I got to hear. He said, I'm going to keep you on. Can you stay over the commercial break and we'll talk more? Okay, Mr. Wease, let's do it. So I began to talk about why I believe that Jesus is the Messiah. What I didn't know on that first day of the Last Jihad book tour, a media tour, was that question was going to become the number one most asked question as I've traveled all over the world. And the number two asked question, and they sort of jockey, the other one is, where is America in Bible prophecy? And that's why I wrote the book Implosion that comes out later this year. But tonight, I want to answer that question. I was actually, seriously, it's been amazing how many times I've gotten asked this question. How can you be Jewish and believe in Jesus? I was once in Morocco, and I was invited to the home of a top Muslim scholar there, somebody I was interviewing for a different book that I was writing at the time. And we're sitting, so we get to his home, and it was a great honor. I mean, he had been to my home, and now I was at his home, and he was having this dinner party with other high-ranking officials in the Moroccan government there. And anyway, during the dinner party, as we began, he stood up and he said a Muslim prayer over the food, and then we, sat down and began to eat. And the first question he asked when he sat down, he said, "Now, Joel, you're Jewish, right?" I said, "Well, on my father's side, I am." He says, "But clearly, as I've gotten to know you, you believe in Jesus as the Messiah, the Savior, right?" I do. Well, I don't really understand that. How can you be Jewish and believe in Jesus? Here I am in one of the top Muslim scholars in the whole Islamic world, much less there in that particular country, and I was getting to ask that question again. So let's talk about that. And I want to talk about my spiritual journey tonight, and not how I became a writer, but how my family came to find that Jesus really is the Messiah. And what does that mean to us? And why is that important to us?